Hi, I'm Ann Coulter. Welcome to my Substack. I have today a guest I've been dying to have on, uh, Robert Kennedy Jr., because I love people who take anti-conventional views, whatever those views are. If you're not familiar with my work, that includes your father's former boss, Joe McCarthy. So I was thinking of having an entire interview about Joe McCarthy. It'd be hilarious. But no, I don't want to do that. You have a lot of interesting positions. So I mostly want to hit on foreign and things I like your unconventional positions on. I mostly want to hit on foreign policy, immigration, and the big one, the media. Welcome.
Thank you, Ann. Joe McCarthy had this peculiar relationship with my family was because he was an Irish Catholic, and there were many, many other things to admire about him that my family admired about him. He was a boxer. He had a very, very, very good boxer. He had been a hero during World War II. He'd been a tail gunner and had seen some of the hottest combat in the war. We had a lot in common with my uncle, with John Kennedy, and he was close to my grandfather because he was one of the few Irish Catholics in the United States Senate at that time. And my father went to work for him uh, when he after he served as general counsel the Labor Committee. He served on the House Un-American Activities Committee for a very short time under McCarthy. He had a feud with Roy Cohn, who was the chief counsel, and the two of them had a kind of a lifelong enmity towards each other that came close to violence on several occasions. And on one famous occasion in particular, and then my father broke with McCarthy um, over, and McCarthy would come to our house at the Cape, and he would participate in all the sports. He, play football, play touch football. He was game for anything. My family had a tradition of dragging off the back of the sailboat, so they'd throw a line off the back with a life preserver at the end of it, and then people would jump in the water and hold on while the sailboat dragged them through the waters of Nantucket Sound. And it was a little bit, it was dicey. And you would not want to do it if you didn't know how to swim. And Joe McCarthy did not know how to swim. But he jumped off the boat anyway into the Atlantic and held onto that rope, and he nearly drowned. And he was very good humored about it. So they and he was a wonderful, charming man, and he was like a lot of these people that they're very charming and kind, and good father, son, daughter, friend, and then you put a microphone in their hand and give them some power, and they kind of turn into monsters. And my father saw that aspect of McCarthy. My father was a very loyal guy, and he separated from McCarthy, and he went to the minority council of that same committee, which was McClellan. And McClellan and that team in the end brought down McCarthy. And McCarthy died shortly after that. He was an alcoholic, and that was part of his kind of bonhomie. But and of his charm, he would drink and really have a good time, and he was very, very entertaining. My father was very loyal, and McCarthy did die. By then, he'd been discredited in front of the nation, and he was kind of a pariah and despised. And my father, nevertheless, and no Democratic politician would be seen with him, would be seen dead with him because it was a career ender. But when he died, my father flew out to Appleton, Wisconsin, and went to his funeral, because that's the kind of guy that my dad was. And, he remembered McCarthy for who he'd been. He remembered the affection, the friendship they had. And that came back to haunt him later because the liberals never liked my father. And, the New York Times refused to endorse him when he ran for Senate in 64 or for president in 68. And the liberal democratic clubs all over the country were against him. All of the liberal newspapers, from the New York Times to the Village Voice, were against him. And in the '68 election, the liberals went went to McCarthy rather than my father. They sided with McCarthy, and my and
Different.
so that was, that was part of the story about my dad. One, liberals said he was ruthless and he was anti-union because he had fought against the Teamsters Union and Jimmy Hoffa again, tried to get corruption of those unions, and that made him anti-union. To the liberal, uh, to the liberal in liberal Gestalt, and that he had sided with Joe McCarthy, but his relationship with Joe McCarthy was very complicated. It was, and it was not the simple version that people said of him. It was much more complex, and I really admire my dad's loyalty, and I learned a lot from that. And even when people you separate, divide politically with people in life, that you still remember your friendship and the loyalty and the kindness and the good parts of their character. And one of the things my mom told me when I was little is you always go to funerals, because you'll see at a funeral when people are speaking, you remember the whole person, and not just that little part of the person that they may have become at the end of their careers.
Well, I think McCarthy would have been better off jettisoning Roy Cohn for your brother, considering the Army McCarthy hearings. We'll see what brought him down, because Roy Cohn had a crush on, what was it, Bill Shine in the Army. Wanted to get
David Shine.
David Shine. Thank you.
Was his lover, and he had gotten him a cushy job in the Army so that he wouldn't have to go to combat. And at the same time, he was accusing the Army of hiring homosexuals and rooting homosexuals out of the State Department. He was like really the kind of the apex of hypocrisy. It's almost admirable how what a utter
Yes, he was hard. Well, I think your father and uncle and their father are three of the rare Democrats I've had very nice things to say about, because they were also genuine anti-communists, which may be why the liberals hated them so much. I mean, as I think I've heard you talk about, your father and Nixon actually had very, very similar positions on fighting the Cold War, and also were sort of genuinely friends.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Nixon was a really interesting character, and he had a very dark side to him, and which ended up in Watergate. And Watergate is a very complicated issue, as you know. But Nixon also was, I think, every generation is more different than the current generation, than your enemies in the current generation. You have more common with your enemies in our generation than you will have with what's going on with all the people in the next generation in many ways. And in Nixon, if you look at again the whole man, he was a genius in many ways. He wrote all of his own speeches. He did his own thinking. He listened to people, and he wasn't doctrinaire. He was very cynical politically. He would use people in ways, and he would demonize people who shouldn't have been demonized in order to get, and he would do things for political advantage that were kind of underhanded and cynical and Machiavellian. But he wanted peace in the world, and and it was those impulses that led him, that enabled him, his ideological bona fides, the credibility that he had from being a lifelong anti-communist, that allowed him to go out and reach out to the Chinese and to open up China to the rest of the world. it enabled him to do other things, with the Vietnam War and the secret war in Cambodia that were very, very underhanded and probably, could classify him as a war criminal. But and if somebody else had won the wars, he would have been accused of that. But he also had this other side to him that was very thoughtful and very smart, and he had an affection for my uncle and for my father. And after my dad died, he called my mom many times and would commiserate with her, sometimes very late at night and maybe not entirely sober. He also wrote letters to me when I was a kid. I reached out to him a couple of times, and he was very kind and taking time. One of the things he did, I began collecting presidential signatures when I was young. And at that time, you could get presidential signatures very cheaply. They were very available, and you could easily buy for, a couple $100. Even George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It's interesting that the presidents for a long time when I was collecting them, the older presidents were the ones that were easiest and cheapest to buy because they were signing their names all the time, and they signed so many documents, and that's what they did all day. In the latter days, finding an authentic signature of Richard Nixon is one of the hardest things to do because he had a machine that could sign his name in 26 different ways. It would sign RN, RMN, Richard Nixon, Dick Nixon, Dick, Richard Milhouse Nixon, in every possible configuration. And it was very good. They had just invented that machine. So he rarely signed anything himself. And getting his signature was almost impossible. And an authentic copy of his signature was almost impossible to do. And it was much more expensive than getting even like Thomas Jefferson or Andrew Jackson, who were writing all the time. And
do you still have the collection? You could auction it.
I do. I still have it. I have all the presidents, and I wrote him a personal letter, and I explained to him that issue, and he wrote me a long letter back about my dad that was very kind. And then he sent me a whole bunch of business cards with his name on them. Clearly it was an authentic signature. So I still have those.
You can watch complete episodes of Unsafe with Ann Coulter by subscribing to anncoulter.substack.com. That's anncoulter.substack.com. You can also listen to complete episodes for free at Ricochet.com. Choose Unsafe from the pull-down menu at the top of the page. That's Ricochet.com, your home for civil center right conversation on the web.